move this closer. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for dealing with the schedule changes, the venue changes, the cold weather. We really appreciate all of your patience and flexibility, but we're gonna have a good conversation, and we're really thrilled that you all are here with us this morning. My name is Jafreen Uddin. I am the Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to amplifying and publishing storytelling and artistry by Asian and Asian diasporic writers. We have an event space in Chelsea. We do public programs. We have a digital magazine. Please check out AAWW.org for any and all information. Lily Philpott, our Director of Programs, who is here in the green sweater, has mini zines that has all of the information about our programming. Please grab one from her on your way out this morning. As you may have heard, there are no book sales, unfortunately. This morning, I encourage you to please check out your local bookshop in Brooklyn or online. Books Are Magic is not too far from here. All of our panelists have amazing work out, and please support them and buy their books. So yeah, let's get started. I'm gonna read the bios of our panelists kind of one at a time, and I'm gonna ask each of them to actually introduce themselves in addition to the professional bio, telling us a little bit about who they are, where their story began, and place or places that their family has called home. So let's start with Crystal. Crystal Hana Kim is the author of If You Leave Me, which was a Booklist Editor's Choice title and named a Best Book of 2018 by over a dozen publications. She is the recipient of many awards that I won't bother listing because there's too many. And she has a second novel forthcoming called The Stone Home. Crystal, tell us about yourself.
Hi everybody, how's everybody doing? Cold? Oh no. Well, thank you so much for coming. I know it's rainy and it was a little hectic with all the changes. So I really appreciate you all being here and sharing your love of literature. My name is Crystal Hana Kim, and I am a Korean American writer. My parents immigrated here to Queens in the 1980s, shortly before I was born, and I was born in Flushing. I've lived in New York predominantly my whole life, and I write about Korea a lot. My first novel, If You Leave Me, is set in Korea during the Korean War and in the years following, about 15, 16 years. And then my second novel which is forthcoming in 2024, is set in 1980s Korea. And so I'm often interested in where I come from and the ways in which colonialism, war, violence, the way that the country of Korea was made reverberates through time to my generation. So that's what I write, and I often joke that one day I'll write about the present, but I'm just following the arc of the past, and one day I'll write about now.
There's already so much to mine from in the past. Thank you, Crystal. Next up is Jennifer Chowdhury. Jennifer has been a human rights storyteller for over a decade, reporting on the South Asian diaspora and gender rights as a journalist for The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Guardian, and Elle magazine. She has spent 2 years in Bangladesh covering the Rohingya refugee crisis and has translated her passion for advocacy, storytelling, and human rights reporting into digital content for the United Nations World Food Program as an editorial manager. As a nonfiction writer, she writes about her lived experiences as a Bangladeshi American working class child of immigrants. Jennifer, tell us about yourself.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. Very similar to Crystal. That's my daughter, in case you guys couldn't tell. My parents also immigrated here in the 1980s from Bangladesh, actually via Germany, which I think somewhere along the way today, I can tell you more about that. And then I was born in Queens at Elmer's Hospital. And very similar to you, Crystal, I write a lot about the past, the present, and what my identity, how my identity intersects all of this. I did spend 2 years in Bangladesh covering the Rohingya refugee crisis, which is another war in itself right now, and it was really interesting and eye-opening to see a country that's super young is still grappling with after effects of its independence in 1971 from Pakistan, and before that from colonial India, to now house over 1 million refugees. And what does that mean? So that has really changed my lived experience as a descendant of Bangladeshis and being a part of the diaspora.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next up is Lee Tran. Lee is the author of House of Sticks. She is a Columbia University graduate with a degree in creative writing and linguistics and has received fellowships from McDowell, Art Omi, and Yaddo. Lee?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Tran. I am the author of House of Sticks, and it's a memoir about my life as a Vietnamese refugee here in New York City. I was born in Vietnam, and my family and I immigrated to New York City through something known as the humanitarian operation, which helped resettle former prisoners of war here in the States. My father served about a 10-year sentence in the re-education camps of Vietnam after serving time as a lieutenant in the South Vietnamese Army. My first memory, which is when my book begins, was at the age of 3, waking up in the Thai refugee camps. So my journey explores what it means to be a refugee, what it means to be Vietnamese. I also have Chinese heritage, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a girl as well. I have 3 older brothers. And then just uncovering those layers of identity one by one and figuring out who I am beyond all of that. So, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Lee. And last but not least, we have Faleeha Hassan. Faleeha is a poet, playwright, writer, teacher, and editor. She is the first woman to write poetry for children in Iraq. Her poems have been translated into 21 languages, and she's received numerous awards in the Middle East. Faleeha?
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Faleeha Hassan. I'm from Iraq. I born in Iraq in 1967, and I was, I do remember the first day of my middle school, the Iraqi government announced that they would close the school for 10 days until certain victory over the Iraqi-Iran war was announced. But unfortunately, this war didn't end with 10 days. It lasts for 8 years, and all my friends and my relatives, they either get killed or missing in this war. While poetry comes easily to me, I have long dreamed to write a detailed memoir about the horrors of war that I personally experienced, as well as my friend and family, the hardship, the horrible hardship my friend and my family endured. In the war, I believe in the war, there are so many hidden events. The author must write about them, then the leader, they will wake up and think 1,000 times before they start a new war. And I'm thrilled that my book, War and Me, right now, it's available for all English-speaking reader. And the people they love, I hope every reader will find what they like in this book. For example, those people, they love the adventure. They will see a character. They went to the battlefields looking for father and brothers. And those who love to, or they are curious to know about the Iraqi families, how they deal with, how they live the Iraqi family during the war with Iran. And they will see how the Iraqi innocent people faced death and starvation all these years. And those people who are curious to learn about the Iraqi custom, they will find the richness of these custom and tradition and how the society of Iraq deal with the dead and living. And the important thing in this book, the reader will see how the war can affect the innocent people, whether they are soldiers, women, or just kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Faleeha. All right, let's get into it. So, I mean, all of you mentioned in different ways how the past and the experiences of older generations have shown up in your work. A lot of times, you know, especially as children of immigrants, older generations don't actually like to talk about the past or like to talk about, you know, what they lived through. So as writers who are kind of contending with this history, both how do you approach just the effect the war in whatever form has had on your community, especially when maybe you're not hearing from, say, your parents or other relatives, but also how do you care for yourselves while doing this work? I'll open it up to the floor.
I can speak to this. Yeah, it's taking me so many years to like learn all of the stories and I still don't have it, I think, all the pieces that really like led to you know, my parents' experiences. Like I can talk about my father. He was a student activist in the 70s, and you know, I mentioned earlier that my family lived in Germany briefly, and it's because he was part of a socialist agricultural movement, and once once the country attained independence, you know, it was moving in a different direction. There were, you know, the country was trying to gain its footing. People were trying to assert power and position, and the movement that my father was a part of was kind of, you know, falling to the wayside, or, you know, not center stage anymore. And so he was very young. He was like, I think around 21. And so in 1977, he basically migrated to West Germany as a migrant worker, along with a few other friends of his, and also I think my uncle. And that's where really my family story began. And it took me, and I share this but so easily, but it took me so many years to actually get the story out of him. Because like, oh yeah, you know, like, I was involved in politics, and this is how laissez-faire, like, his telling is, like, I was involved in politics, and it wasn't really working out, so your grandfather was like, well, people are, like, going to Germany, so why don't you just go? And I'm like, okay, but this is 1970s West Germany, right? So, like, that in itself is, like, a whole, like, experience that I haven't even gotten out of him yet. And then they couldn't leave the country, they couldn't live, they lived in Bonn, they couldn't leave the city, they weren't allowed to really go anywhere. And then my mother, they got married a few years after that on the telephone without ever seeing each other. And my grandparents just put my mother on a plane and just said, here's a picture of your husband. He lives in Germany, and go live happily ever after. And my mom also, same thing. I'm like, well, how did you feel when you first saw Dad? Oh, he was there, and then we went home, and he brought me like grapes or something. And I'm like, what? Like, a breakup is more traumatic for me than that, you know? And then so then they immigrated to the United States. And okay, well, how did you guys decide to do that? Well, your mom was pregnant. And we were like, yeah, you can't, like, if we have a kid here, she or he wouldn't get citizenship. In the US, you do. There's birthright. So yeah, we just, like, got on a plane to the Bahamas, and then I got on a boat, like a fishing boat, and then just like went to Miami and like got off on the shore and sat there for a little while and pretended we were tourists, and then they took us to like, it literally, this is how harrowing, right? Like, I see your expression, but this is how I was told this my entire life. Like, yeah, you know, we were just like in a locked house for like 3 days, And yeah, then we flew to New York, and then we ended up in Brooklyn and Coney Island, and then we moved to Queens because it was nicer. Like, it was just like, that's it. If I had to write the novel, that would be their version. And I'm like, I have lots of questions, like lots of questions. So to answer your question, that's like the synopsis, and I'm still uncovering, and my mother's here, and I'm hoping after this, one of my reasons for bringing her here is that I hope that she'll tell me more. And I think a part of that is not that they don't want to say it. I don't think there's so much deep-seated trauma that they can't even reveal to themselves. And so that was my whole point of becoming a storyteller, of a writer, of a journalist, to be able to share these stories someday. Yeah.
Crystal?
Yeah. That was very funny, even though I'm sure it was quite harrowing for them. I think what you're saying about how the generation that is most directly impacted by the violence, they are trying to endure, and it's too hard to talk about. And I think that's so true because my grandparents and some of my aunts and uncles survived the Korean War. And Korea is a small enough country. Everybody who was there was impacted in some way. And yet my parents, who were both born right after the war, did not hear much about that experience growing up because their family was too busy trying to survive. It's too difficult for them to talk about. And I think what I realized was that because I'm 2 generations removed, and also because my mother's the only one of her siblings who moved outside of Korea, I think that geographic and temporal distance allowed my grandmother to open up to me in a way that she does not with her other children who are closer, physically closer. And so my maternal grandmother and I are really close. She came here when I was an infant to help take care of me. We have a close bond, and when I was older in my teens and I would ask her about her childhood, she told me these extremely emotional, grief-laden stories about being a refugee during the Korean War, about the daily aspects of survival. And these were stories that my mother had not heard of. And my mother was asking, why don't I know this? And I think she needed that time. She needed the 40 years to be able to share those stories. And so much of the stories were emotional for her in a way that made the war feel like it was happening now. And I think some of that was because she couldn't process it. A lot of it was grief and regret in the way that her life was shaped by the fact that she had to live through a war, live through colonialization, and then 5 years of independence, and then a war. And then also because she's a woman, and her choices were so limited. And she talks all the time about how she wanted an education, but had to get married for security, and the regret that she feels, even though it led to my mother and her children, but the grief that she feels. And so when I started writing seriously, I just felt compelled to write about the domestic daily experience, especially with a woman at its center for my novel. Yeah. What about you all?
Yeah, I think storytelling as a mode of healing and as a coping mechanism is something that we all share and our families share.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard to speak about war without speaking about mental illness, and you both mentioned trauma. As you can imagine, my father, having spent almost a decade in the re-education camps of Vietnam, suffers severely from post-traumatic stress disorder. So my book, House of Six, explores mental illness, both his trauma, but also inherited trauma, so the trauma that I and my brothers inherited, living under his roof. When I was 8, I was sent home with a letter from a nurse saying that I needed glasses, and my father thought that glasses were a government conspiracy to take away my eyesight, because paranoia is one of the symptoms of PTSD. And having suffered from political persecution in Vietnam, it's not hard to imagine why he would feel that way. But what that meant was that I spent almost a decade of my own imprisonment, myopic imprisonment, unable to see the board in school, unable to even see myself in the mirror. And so my sense of identity was incredibly fractured, and I had to, spend, through the process of writing this book, try to heal from that while also trying to gain the distance that I needed in order to write about it in a way that was authentic and honored my truth. But, in order to glean certain stories about my father's experiences, about my mother's experiences, being married to him, trying to gain an understanding of their motivations as my parents, trying their best to just navigate this new land while also dealing with their demons. It was a really difficult time trying to get those stories from them. But I remember when I was just a child, when I was 5 or 6 years old, my father would send us to bed with these bedtime stories that no one would ever consider a nice bedtime story for a 5-year-old, but it was about his experiences trying to escape the re-education camps and almost being shot down. And I remember questioning, what does it mean to be a prisoner? And at the age of 5, you have very limited language capacity. And what does it mean to be, what is even war? And as I discovered these truths for myself, that's when I started to be able to tell my story and tell my family's story.
And because I was a witness of this war, I spent all my lifetime with war, with the Iraqi-Iran war. I spent all my teenage and with the Kuwait war. And also the second part of my life, I spent it with the injustice blockade. That lasts for 12 years. I try to be, when I did write this book, I tried to, first time to heal myself from all these bad experience, and the second things, I try to share the harsh consequences that the war can cause for warring nation, and also because in my opinion there is no victory in any war. You will lose. Like even if you feel you are winner for any kind of war, you will lose someone. You will lose your friend, your parents, your family, and this is what happened to me. I lost almost my whole family in this war, and I hope when you read the book, you will see the details of our victory. If we can say there is a victory in any war, but I don't think there is.
Thank you all. Crystal, you mentioned feeling kind of compelled to tell these stories. Each of you in different ways have made this choice to confront and contend with wartime and its trauma. Did you feel it was a choice artistically? Did you feel obligated as children of immigrants or descendants of war? And along those lines, kind of how do you think about your writing and approaching the work in a way that isn't tokenized and not, not being defined by your oppression?
Yeah, I felt compelled to. And I don't think it was an obligation, but there was this strong desire to write about the Korean War. And I think it would have been inevitable in a sense that this would be the subject of my first novel, at least, because so much of the way that my mother and my father was shaped and the way they parented me was because of the way that they were treated, right, in the aftermath of the war. And though my parents may not have been able to articulate that to me, by learning about my history, I began to understand why they acted certain ways. And so there was this ripple effect that I felt really compelled to write about. And that's why my novel, the first novel, is not just taking place during the years of the war, which is still in a stalemate, but not during 1950 to 1953, but a decade and more after that, because I was so interested in the after effects and the way the children are affected, and the way that though war may end in our history textbooks, the impact and the trauma and the effects are lifelong and generational. And I think, to answer the second part of your question, when I'm writing, I write because I'm driven by questions. I don't write because I think like this is what I want to tell people or this is what I want to teach people. As a fiction writer, I have a couple of questions that I want to understand for myself or get closer to a truth. And that can be something like, what is war? What is the impact of war? What is the impact of the Korean War on the women, children, grandchildren who were not on the battlefronts, but were heavily scarred? So I write with a question in mind, and because I am exploring through these questions, I also write from the perspective of Koreans, and so it centers that experience, and it centers a Korean experience, and my hope is that the ideal reader is someone like me who is trying to understand their history in a deeper way. I mean, do I want a broader audience? Of course, but if those others are willing to enter a book without being in the center. Yeah. What about you all?
Anyone? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I guess it's me. Yeah, I don't, between, whether or not it was a choice or I was compelled to, I don't think it was either. I think I just didn't have a choice but to write about war and about my experiences, because it's so intricately tied to my experiences as a Vietnamese refugee. Yeah, when I first embarked on this journey of writing my memoir, I made a promise to myself not to seek permission from anyone but myself to write my story, because I didn't want others, versions of reality to taint my own perception, especially, growing up with trauma, growing up feeling like you're always lost, you're on the brink of identities. I wanted this to be, in some small way, an act of liberation from the shackles of war, so that I can finally start to heal. So in terms of, writing in a way that isn't tokenized, I think specificity gives birth to universality. And so I tried as much as possible to just stick to the facts of my life, and allow that to blossom in whatever ways that it could, and to make it a deeply human story, not just an Asian American story, not just a refugee story, but a story about who I am as a person, as a human being.
I love that.
Because the war is a very big subject, and you just can have your imagination, help you to write about it. And for me, like the war, you need to be there in this moment in the war to write about the war. You need to feel the siren when the airplane come in and try to attack people. You need to be there when to see the fear in the faces of the kids when they try to look about shelter. And this is what we did. This is what I experienced, and my family, and all my people. That's why I said I'm going to write this war, this memoir, not because there is no choice for me. I need to write it. Then someone one day will read it and, think 1,000 times to start a new war, or maybe they refuse to have the same mistake what the other people make.
I had this one very big question since I was, really young, which is, why did my parents get married? Because my mother got married at 15, and this is a very, and as I, got older and I, studied and read, and I'm like, oh, Bangladesh is synonymous with child marriage, and and that made me angry and also ashamed, but then also just like perplexed as to why. My mother and I are only 20 years apart, and as a mother, I understand, and I'm starting to see things where I'm like, oh, this is why she did that when I was 10, or this is like, but I didn't understand when I was really young that is a larger political question that I'm asking as to why I had a child. My mother was a child bride, and then I think. Really, my early on in my career, and which I still, do to a certain extent, was very much revolved around gender rights, and it all comes from this one question of why did my mom get married at 15? And it didn't make any sense to me because my mother grew up in the city, she went to a good school, she grew up in the capital, she played sports, she had lots of friends, we weren't necessarily poor, we didn't fit in all of like the stereotypes that you would think of why, people get their children married young. So why? My grandmother was very stylish. None of my aunts got married that young. And, I learned through my work that it's because she is a product of the war, of a war for independence. And yes, they had all of these things that I had mentioned, but there was no stability in the country. And like I mentioned earlier, my father was a student activist and migrated to a Western country, so life was better outside of the country. And so that's really the short answer as to why that happened. But I think that question has led me to write, to answer that question, and I'm still answering that question.
Thank you all. So you've all written and write in different genres, which is one of the reasons I was so happy of this particular group coming together. Can you talk a little bit about just like a craft choice of, why that genre and why you felt it was the best vessel or channel to tell the story or stories that you want to tell? Anyone can start.
I can piggyback off of what I was saying earlier. When I was a kid, I just wanted to write books. I wanted to write stories. I don't know if I necessarily wanted to be a journalist, but as I got older, I realized very early on that there were ways in which stories of POCs and women and, especially where my family is from, get manipulated so easily. And I didn't want that in the beginning. I was like, I want to tell the facts. I want to tell real people's lives, real people's stories. And so that's where I think my journalism started. Now, however, then I started writing memoir. I started writing a lot of first person because I realized that kind of wasn't enough for me. I wanted to share my personal experience. I realized, the personal is political. So that's sort of like the direction I started heading into and like continuing on now.
When I was younger, I tried to look for myself in all the stories that I read, and I could never find it. I never found that little girl who was a refugee, who was, making ties and cummerbunds. Actually, my first job in America was at the age of 3 years old doing sweatshop labor with my family on the living room floor making ties and cummerbunds. Every 4 ties earned us $1. And then I couldn't see the board in school and for so many years. And then I was working in a nail salon. So I was always searching for stories that represented me, that made me feel seen and validated, that told me that my experiences were real. And I never found that. I remember in the 9th grade, I read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And it was the first book to move me to tears, because here was a little black girl, Pecola Breedlove, who yearned for a pair of new eyes, albeit a very different reason from my own. She wanted a pair of blue eyes so that she could be deemed worthy in the eyes of others. And yet, that is where I found representation in some small way. And so I remember thinking, I would love one day to have the power to move somebody else to tears because they felt seen. And that's what led me on the path towards becoming a writer. And I went to school. I actually majored in fiction. And I wanted my first book to be a novel that was loosely based on my life. But I had a professor, Saeed Serafazadeh, who is an incredible memoirist, novelist, and I took a course with him in nonfiction, and he championed my story. He said, Lee, you should really write this as nonfiction. And when I met my agent, she said the same thing, and I realized that I had been hiding behind the veil of fiction because I was too afraid at that point in time to really confront what I had experienced. And so when I made the switch to nonfiction, I felt really afraid, but I needed to muster up all the courage I needed in order to write this story. And ultimately, I'm glad, because what it means is that some other little girl, some other little boy, or anyone in the world who feels alone in their experiences and who might have experienced what I experienced could finally see themselves represented.
Faleeha?
Yeah, because during the war, we don't have time to enjoy ourselves. We was try to survive the war. And when we have, like this is me, when I have some leftover time, this is what I call, I will go and read. And all my reading, this time it was just poetry. And that's why, like, I don't know, anytime I wake up, I will find a notebook, and you know, it's close to my pillow, and there's some sentences in this notebook. It's like, but then I find out it's a poems, but I didn't realize before it's poetry. And in 1991, my first book, Because I Am a Girl, it's born. And from this moment, because in the blockade, we have our land by ourselves. There's no internet, we don't know nothing about other war, just the Iraq by itself. And we have just Iraqi channel in our TV. We don't know what's going on. This is why I try to write poetry and also read a lot. And I read so many books. From this moment, I think I was dreaming to write more and find what's going on in the world.
Mm. Crystal?
Yeah, I love reading poetry.
Yeah.
I think I'm the only one here who's writing fiction, although Lee, I guess there's a novel ahead, perhaps, right? For me, I write essays, but my favorite form is long-form fiction, and I think that's because, again, I'm always constantly looking backwards in order to understand why we, myself, but also society, my country, why we are the way we are now. And to me, looking backwards is how I've mined for answers. And by tracing my family history from my parents to my grandparents, I'm able to write about a time that I wasn't present or alive in, but I'm also able to, through fiction, move perspectives and add in other interests that I have, questions about what does it mean to be a woman during this time. But this novel also has 5 narrators, so I can go between the central female character to these other male narrators. What does it mean, and how can I compare these different lives so that the reader can see and feel and experience alongside these characters how different people's lives were based on the privileges and circumstances that they were placed in. And I think that long-form fiction allows the reader and the writer to interrogate, to question, to examine political history through emotion and through multiple perspectives. And that's something that I really love about fiction.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm going to start with Faleeha and work our way down to wrap up. Each of you are mining such kind of rich histories that maybe a lot of people in our audience might not know about. So what are some of the best resources or recommendations you have for anybody that might want to learn about the places that you all are writing from and the periods that you all are writing about? It can be books, movies, websites, anything that you just recommend as somebody who's really embraced and kind of engrossed in these eras. Faleeha, why don't we start with you?
Because I watched so many movies made about the Iraqi-Iran war and the Kuwait war, and I find out there are so many mistakes in these movies. I can't recommend any movies, but yeah, because they dress differently, they prepare the food is different, the names on the shops is different from the Iraqi dialogue. That's why, in my opinion, if you like to know better about the Iraq, go and spend some time in Iraq, if you like, or read my book.
Perfect plug. Lee?
Yeah, I think right now it's a very exciting time to be a Vietnamese American writer, because there have been just all these books recently published on the Vietnamese American experience. So just a few recommendations. The Mountains Sing by Nguyen Phang Huy Mai, an incredible book that I highly recommend. There's Saigon by Phuc Tran. There's, The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. There's The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. All of these are incredible books that I read while I was on the journey in writing my memoir. And I guess, like Faleeha, I can't quite recommend any movies, but yeah, I don't know, listen to Vietnamese music.
I share similar sentiments, and in that there definitely aren't a lot of movies I can recommend, and if I can say so, there are Indian movies that you'll find that are about the 1971 war, because they helped us. They were our allies in achieving independence from Pakistan. But in those, every single one of those movies, it's their war, and a bunch of people in this particular land happen to get free as a result of it. So that's the narrative. So cannot recommend any movies. 2 books that have really informed my career and just my passions have been Brick Lane by Monica Ali. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. Probably my favorite book by a Bangladeshi UK author. And then I would say A Golden Age by Tamina Anam. That's also both fiction, but really, really wonderful books. And I would shout out a Instagram account called Brown History that I love. It's not particular to Bangladesh, it's the South Asian subcontinent, but they really tell stories that are very under the radar, really underreported, and very niche. So I would go check them out for sure. Yeah.
I'm gonna check those out. Similarly to what you were saying about the Indian movies, I think that the Korean War, when taught here, it's called the Forgotten War, and when it's taught here, it's often from the American soldier's perspective. So if you want to learn about the Korean War from a Korean domestic perspective, or Korean, national person's perspective, there are memoirs. There's one that I read for this novel called I Will Shoot Them From My Loving Heart, by Won Moon Ho, that I found really interesting. There's a memoir called Remembering Korea by H.K. Shin. But again, when I was researching this novel, I found a complete lack of information about the domestic experience. Those stories were just not written. And so what I turned to were oral histories, documentation, studies on mental health, and depression when there's no word or label for it. So, sometimes you have to get kind of creative with your research. I also found a wonderful imprint or organization called, I think it's called the City History Compilation Committee of Seoul. And they have these wonderful books that they make that are organized by decade, and they're just all photographs of Seoul changing over time. And the book is organized by infrastructure, buildings, educational movements, clothes. And so just getting creative and really looking outside, thinking outside of the box, I think helps with research.
Also, I just realized Brick Lane is a movie now also.
Oh, really?
Because I always think about the book, so there is the movie, and it's good. Usually books and movies, but that one is good, yeah.
We can vouch for that one. Thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. Thank you for spending some time with us this morning. Thank you all for being here. As a reminder, all of these amazing writers have books and work available for purchase. Not here in person, unfortunately, but online. Books are magic. Any local bookstore, please support their amazing work. And thank you all again for spending some time with us this morning, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Moderating. You guys make it so easy. I just sit there. We're going to stand here, I think, and take a photo. Yeah. Let's stand. That'll be easier for the phone, I think. I'm going to squeeze in the middle. Yeah.
Another round of applause for these amazing women. Thank you for leading the charge. Coming up at 12 p.m., we have a major ingredient is the cook, which is so true, because how else we going?